Hello, fellow adventurers. Ready to embark on another misadventure? Welcome back to my channel, your gateway to magical stories. Today, we're delving into The Head of the Horseman, Episode 10 in the Gretchen's Misadventures series by P.A. Mason. In this tale, join us as we follow Gretchen on a quest to retrieve her trusty witch's hat from the phantom in the woods and help Piper ace her next academy assignment. Sit back and relax, and let's unravel the enchantment of the Head of the Horseman. Chapter 1. Homework? Gretchen rubbed her eyes and took a healthy swig of ale. I don't remember signing up for that. We agreed you'd go to the academy during the day. If they want you making potions, they can do it during school hours. Piper gave Gretchen a level stare from across the table at the salt and bog. Cramped handwriting filled the notebook splayed in front of her, and Gretchen wondered what else she had in store for their spare time. The other students get to go on a field trip in the forest after dark to look for luminescent mushrooms. Since I'm with you, I need... The door of the tavern swung open with an almighty bang, and Gretchen turned in her seat to see Nora step in, her face a frenzied mask of victory. I've done it, she announced. I told that snooty little pipsqueak where he can shove his job. She hooked her boot around the door to close it, and the silence that followed in the taproom was heavy with shock. Gretchen's eyes flickered between Jürgen, Piper, Nora, and even the gnomes in the corner, waiting for the spell to break. Nobody said a word, and Nora held up her arms with an indignant scowl. Well, isn't anyone going to say anything? Congratulations, perhaps. Jürgen cleared his throat from behind the bar and thumped a tankard under a tap. I suppose that calls for a drink. Next round's on me. Nora swaggered to the bar to the cheers of the gnomes. Tonight we party. Gretchen realised her jaw was hanging open and clicked her teeth shut with a shiver. It was the last thing she'd expected to hear on a quiet afternoon while taking respite from the cold at her favourite watering hole. Nora had been in the Baron's employ for years, and in recent times had taken more than one blow on his account without complaint. After taking a gulp from her tankard, Nora spun on her heel and made her way to their table. Gretchen met Jürgen's eyes over Nora's shoulder, and the burly troll only shrugged. When her pal dropped to the chair beside her with a contented sigh, Gretchen grasped for words to keep Nora busy, while she reconciled with the news. What? Ah, well, tell me what happened. Nora grinned and laced her fingers over her midsection as Piper tucked her notebook into her satchel. Jürgen ambled over, wiping his hands with a dishcloth, and pulled up a seat to listen in. Gretchen reckoned even the gnomes would tilt their ears in Nora's direction, and that soon the tavern would be brimming with all sorts of magical ilk seeking gossip and free grog. Well, Nora drew a deep breath. It was the last straw, you see. His uptightness took offence to a quip at court by Lady Bishop and insisted I make her bald. Usually I put him off a day or two and he settles down, but this time he wouldn't take no for an answer. She took another gulp of ale and smacked her lips. Now, nobody will accuse me of being squeamish, but I only agreed to bothersome hexes when I signed on. Persistent cases of athlete's foot, boils the size of plums, itching in inconvenient places. But permanent baldness is just too far. She shook her head. And the lady in question is a good egg. She's done me 1 or 2 kindnesses over the years, and I refuse to have her in one of those gaudy wigs for the rest of her days. Gretchen turned her tankard in her palms and bit her lip. Jürgen swallowed and pursed his lips. So, he ventured, I take it things didn't end well? I told the twerp that he needn't spread his misery just because his scalp had long since given up, that he was a master of bitterness and held in low regard among every barony in the kingdom, a cliched man of short stature renowned for an even shorter temper. She waggled her eyebrows and held a finger up. And that without my services he would find himself in a tenuous position among the blue bloods of the realm, and I would laugh heartily at his fall to ruin. Gretchen couldn't help the snort of laughter that escaped her lips, and lamented the fact she hadn't been there to witness the look on the Baron's face. Piper's features remained solemn, and she opened her mouth to speak. Sounds more like you got fired. It was too much, and Gretchen doubled over in her chair, holding her belly as she cackled. Embellishing stories was something of a pastime for Nora, and Gretchen wondered how many times her friend had practiced that little speech on her way to the Salton Bog. She wiped tears from her eyes and strove to get her breath under control. Nora's eyes narrowed. The man might be an idiot, but he isn't stupid. She considered Piper and cocked her head. Dismissing a witch renowned for her hexes would be foolish. No, I quit. It's been something on my mind for some time, and the portents align to that purpose today. Oh? Gretchen held up her tankard to hide her smirk. And what grand plans do you have for the future, then? Nora turned her nose in the air and sat a little straighter. It's about time I take up a seat on the Witches' Council. Mid-gulp, Gretchen's eyes widened, and she sprayed a steady stream of ale across the table. With a hand to her chest, she sucked in a breath of air, and the remaining ale in her mouth went down the wrong hole. Gasping and hacking, she thumped her chest and stood to lean over and regain her composure. The chorus of laughter from the gnomes accompanied Nora's icy voice. Are you quite done? Maybe, Gretchen spluttered and winced before dropping back into her seat. You should really make those kinds of announcements when there's less risk of people choking to death. What is so hard to believe about it? Nora clucked. Gwendolen Blight passed 3 months ago. Those women have been putting off a vote on the next candidate, which tells me they're hard-pressed to find someone worthy of the seat. Aren't they all old and powerful? Piper asked. Gretchen bit the inside of her cheek to hold back another fit of laughter. From the quizzical expression on Nora's face, she clearly couldn't tell which prerequisite Piper thought she lacked. Like really, really old, Piper clarified. Sure, Nora agreed. But what's more important than either of those things is infamy, and there's not a single lord or lady who doesn't know who Nora Brightstar is in this kingdom. Be that as it may. Gretchen kept her tone gentle. The machinations that go on with the council, the old hag club to contend with, is that something you want to sign up for? Gretchen couldn't bring herself to voice doubt over whether the council would welcome Nora into the fold. It's about time those biddies had some fresh eyes and a new perspective at the table. Nora shrugged. And I'm just the witch to do it. Besides, there's been a Brightstar on the council in each generation. It's been 15 years since my Aunt Delilah breathed her last, and that old crone spent the better part of 20 years at the table. Great, Gretchen thought as she took a tentative sip of ale. It appeared the notion was an issue of pride, and that Nora wouldn't be dissuaded from likely embarrassment of being laughed out of the room. So, what about your workroom? Gretchen asked, changing the subject. Magically sealed. I don't trust that spiteful twit. If given the opportunity, he'd empty it of anything valuable. I told him I would be by to collect my things. Nora nodded to Jurgen. Which I hope you can help me with. I can take the wagon over. Jurgen blinked, as though reckoning. Maybe the day after tomorrow. You can keep your things here until... does a councilwoman live in the city? She lives wherever she damn well pleases, Nora chuckled. Most times in their own apartments at the academy. But I'd prefer to get my own digs. In the meantime... Well, I thought I could stay with Gretchen and Piper here. Gretchen's eyes travelled up to the ceiling, mentally picturing the second level of the tavern, where guest bedrooms were in good supply, and left vacant by the publican who decided letting them was too troublesome. Try as she might, she couldn't reconcile the spaciousness with her own cramped cottage, and why Nora would want to stay with her if given an option. Then Nora cleared her throat, and Gretchen blinked. A glimmer of vulnerability lurked in the depths of her friend's eyes, though nobody other than Gretchen would likely have seen it given her confident facade. There was more to the story with the Baron than Nora was letting on, Gretchen wagered, and with grandiose plans ahead of her, Nora evidently wanted a friend by her side. Scratching the back of her neck, Gretchen glanced at Piper with a shrug and then nodded. Of course. What are friends for, huh? I mean, I'm not sure how much you'll like bunking in with me at night, but I suppose it won't be for all that long. Jurgen made a face from behind Nora's shoulder, and Gretchen felt her cheek twitch. Nora only took another swig of ale and dragged her sleeve over her mouth. So, what about my project? Piper folded her arms on the table, and it took a few seconds for Gretchen to recall the problem of the glowing mushrooms. She was about to speak when Nora opened her mouth. Ah, yes, you're at the academy now, huh? Well, I suppose while I've got some time on my hands, I can help you out with whatever potions they've got you brewing. You're at quite a disadvantage with all this towing and froing from the city. Gretchen bristled at the word disadvantage, but only ground her teeth at the vague insult. Piper pulled out her notebook and found the page she'd marked with the ingredients she needed. We need to make a light spell. It will be marked against the strength and the quality of the light. I need luminescent mushrooms, but they're only good for a few hours after picking them. Those glow-in-the-dark ones? Jurgen rubbed his chin. There's plenty of those in the forest. They must be a certain shade. Piper thumbed through the pages. Those with a blue glow will yield a whiter light. Anything that looks white will give the spell a yellow tinge. The blue ones are hard to find. Gretchen propped her head in her hands, struck by the groan-worthy familiarity of her own time at the academy. Pedantic, if you asked her. Light was light. In a dark tunnel, she doubted the quality of the light would matter much to those who found themselves caught in blackness, unaware. Gretchen reckoned she wouldn't care if the light was pink and sparkled in that kind of situation. They are hard to find, Nora agreed. But don't you worry. You and me will brew the best light spell that teacher has seen in years. You can tell him all you have a noteworthy tutor at home. Maybe I can drop in on some of your classes and give out some pointers. So far, Gretchen had done an admirable job of keeping unentangled from the school and its politics. Suppressing a groan, she realised that was just the thing Nora would be looking to stir up in her bid to get on the council. She could already see it, posturing and pushing for the top spot in the class, competition and rivalry at its finest, the exact opposite of her own laid-back educational philosophy that she'd tried to instill in Piper. Great! Gretchen's tone was flat, and she took a big gulp of ale. Well, that's just great. Chapter 2. Gretchen ground her teeth at the table as Nora waffled on about the council, and decided if it kept up much longer, she'd be chewing meat with stumps. She'd heard it all before, at great length, but she'd come to learn there was no shutting Nora up after her third dram of double-distilled witch's brew. And Hattie will cast her vote wherever Marion tells her to. She will be the one who needs convincing, and after Aunt Delilah showed her up back in... Have you helped Piper with her project yet? Gretchen blinked, trying to recall how long Piper said she had to turn the potion in. Nora frowned, and her features went slack. She'd forgotten, Gretchen realised, and bunched her fists under the table until her fingernails bit deep into her palm. Oh, the mushrooms. Nora smacked her lips and glanced out the window. Perhaps tonight. It looks clear out, though the moon isn't too bright. Makes spotting the difference in the glow that much easier. Don't worry about it. Gretchen scraped back her chair and stretched. Piper's in bed. This new school routine is really tiring her out. I'll go get the mushrooms, and we can get her up real early to get the potion done before we leave. Nora opened her mouth to protest, but Gretchen held up a hand to silence her. It's not cheating. I won't drag her out of bed in the middle of the night, and that's all there is to it. A long hike in pixie-infested woods was preferable to listening to Nora prattle on anyhow. Between that and worrying over Piper, who'd become more withdrawn since Nora arrived, it felt like she hadn't had a minute to herself in weeks. She just hoped by the time she got back, Nora would be snoring soundly. If she didn't make it all the way to the bedroom to crash, even better. Well, make sure you take a stout stick with you. Those pixies can be nasty beggars if you wake up a nest. Nora fumbled with the bottle of liquor on the table and poured herself another measure. Sure. Gretchen felt her throat tighten as she tried to keep her voice even. Mulligan gave her the stink eye from the sofa, evidently unimpressed at being Nora's captive audience, and she decided to bring home a pixie as a consolatory gift if the opportunity presented itself. Dried pixie liver cured all cranky feline ills, and with Nora's falcon screeching around in the garden, Mulligan had a persistent case of the sulks. With her cloak around her shoulders and warming gloves tugged over her hands, she tied the infinity pouch to her belt and slipped into the night. The cold air stung her lungs. She marched onward with confidence through the garden and decided against using a light charm to illuminate the dirt lane beyond. It would ruin her eyes for the forage, and she'd taken the track that led into the woods more times than she could count. While she knew of 1 or 2 places she could effectively land in the forest from her broom, each step lifted the cloud of burden that had fogged her mind for the past weeks. At first, Nora's arrival hadn't been so bad. Jurgen was as good as his word, and had made 3 trips to the Baron's estate to collect the decades of arcane junk that Nora had amassed. It meant Nora got out of the house and spent hours sorting through the mess spread over the 2nd level of the tavern. No fewer than 3 incidents involving serious burns had occurred as gnomes slipped upstairs looking for trouble, and Jurgen was looking about as frazzled as Gretchen felt. After gnome-proofing her stuff, though, Nora had become like an unwanted piece of furniture at the cottage, always there, spilling cups of tea or leaving the cauldron caked with grime, pointing out all the little things that needed repairing, but studiously ignoring the garden where she could have helped while Gretchen was at work. The very minute Gretchen and Piper trudged in after getting back from the city, Nora would start talking. Piper snuck away to the sanctuary of her bedroom as soon as she could, while Gretchen tried to turn the conversation from anything other than the council. But despite Gretchen's misgivings, Nora remained steadfast to her course. She wondered what the academy would make of it as she picked her way over a fallen log in her path. It hadn't been there the last time she'd taken a trip into woods, but then with life being so busy, she couldn't remember the last time she'd entered the wilds, where the citizens of Edgewood treaded lightly. Not having to scavenge for supplies was a mark of having moved up in the world, but buying her ingredients in bulk from the city's alchemists just wasn't the same as bringing home a bounty of fresh and more potent greenery. As the scent of leaf mould and pine filled her nostrils, she promised herself to take Piper out one weekend and camp under the stars. Aunt Esme had done the same for both Gretchen and Cordelia when they were growing up, and those expeditions were among the most treasured of her childhood memories. It was a shame that the weather wouldn't get much better for a few months yet. She could sorely use an excuse to get them both out of the house. The sound of running water lay ahead, and Gretchen turned to a crest which led into a sheltered spot where mushrooms often clumped around gnarled roots. There, she picked her way more carefully across the debris of the forest floor, lest she break her neck in near darkness. What were Piper's teachers thinking, anyway? Surely late-night field trips should start in warmer months. The mushroom in question was a hardy sort that grew almost year-round. She'd never once had trouble locating one when her light charms ran out of energy. But the dip over the crest showed barely any glow, and all of it the whiter variety. Not that she'd ever been picky about those kinds of things, but knew if she returned with an inferior specimen, Piper would give her one of those looks. Perfectionists, Gretchen muttered, as she turned to seek another likely patch. It's like they think magic is an exact science. Gretchen stopped as a twig snapped under her boot and fancied she'd heard hoofbeats in the distance, but that was silly. No person would be foolhardy enough to risk breaking their mount's leg in the middle of the night over rough terrain. Straining her ears to try to listen a little closer, only the chirping of crickets disturbed the silence. Pulling her cloak more snugly around her shoulders, Gretchen found her way to the track and continued deeper into the woods. The way forward wound as the track approached, then went around a bend in the Solar River which cut through the wilderness. It was more of a creek in parts, but where the water opened up, trees gave way to farmers' fields which kept Edgewater in agricultural industry. The land sloped upward as Gretchen continued, seeking the wide road that had long since fallen to disuse, carved when the folks of Edgewater sought riches from mines dotted around the forested hills. They'd found easier pickings elsewhere, and the quarry on the opposite side of the town now paved other roads for people to follow. But the crushed quartz remained in the woods and led to another prime mushroom-picking spot, where turned earth and pine needles offered the softest of beds in which to spring from. Gretchen had just spotted a bright white against the shadows when she heard it again. Hoofbeats, this time from behind. She turned on her heel, looking for the telltale glow of a lantern bobbing from a pole, but there was nothing but the glow of the moon through the canopy. Then it stopped, and Gretchen thought she must be going mad. Frowning, she marched on toward the road, resolving to get on her broom and fly back home the minute she had a suitable mushroom. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot felt comfortingly real, tangible even. She spotted the shadowed outline of a mine's entrance up ahead and picked up the pace. Hoofbeats rang out into the night. Gretchen glanced over her shoulder to see a fast-approaching shape and dug her boots into the gravel to run. Veering away from the road, she was almost in the safety of the trees when she tripped on a chunk of quartz. As she fell, air rushed past her and a shrill cry escaped her lungs. She landed hard, gravel scraping her outstretched palms, and rolled onto her side to squint ahead at the rider who continued galloping. At the mouth of the mine, the steed turned with a rear and thundered back toward her. Scrambling to her knees, Gretchen froze when she realized the light of the moon penetrated the figure. She could almost see right through the rider whose head was missing. She was about to get trampled by a headless ghost and his ethereal steed, and she couldn't even convince her limbs to move. The horse was almost upon her, and at the last minute, Gretchen threw herself off the side of the road into prickly thorns. The rider galloped past, and the only solid shape swinging off the saddle was, "My hat!" Gretchen clamped her bloodied palms down on her head. "Why, you little—" The hoofbeats went silent again, and Gretchen's heart leaped into her throat as she untangled herself from the thorns and climbed back onto the road. She could still see the shadow moving ahead, and she fumbled in her pouch to retrieve her broom. There was no time to wonder on how a ghost could handle physical things. Gretchen knew if he got away, she'd never see her hat again. Pulling out the broomstick from her infinity pouch with a victorious snarl, she ran down the road with half a mind for obstacles and sprang off into the night. Her broom was almost accommodating, and though it zipped through the air faster than usual, turbulence didn't prevent her from swinging around to sit as it pursued the horseman almost of its own volition. Pressing downward, she urged her vehicle onward, and it heeded her call with a dizzying push of speed. Her fear was that the ghost would fade away or go coursing off through the trees where her broom couldn't follow, but instead it galloped onwards, and Gretchen hovered on its tail, reaching for her dangling hat. When the horseman produced an axe and swung in an arc at her arm, her broom slowed just enough for it to be a near miss. Gretchen snatched her hand back, her heart hammering in her chest, and wondered what would have happened if the blow had connected. If this ghost could get his mitts on her hat, it stood to reason his weapon could slice, and she screeched in indignation at the absurdity of it all. A clearing lay ahead, and Gretchen knew the track beyond which led into Edgewater was too crowded with trees to penetrate. She'd often thought it was the forest's way of closing the path to intruders after being so rudely defiled. Panic welled in her gut, and she steered upward over the tree line, hoping she could continue the pursuit. But then the horseman vanished in a cluster of prickly thorns and didn't emerge from the other side. Turning circles in the air, Gretchen steered downward and landed on plush grass a few feet from the snarl of twisted branches. She knew from experience the fat, purple berries hanging in clumps offered neither magical properties nor nourishment. She rounded the bush and found no sign of either ghost or hat. Smoothing strands of red hair from her face, Gretchen blinked at the tears pricking her eyes and stared dumbly at the place where the rider vanished. The woods had been her stomping grounds since she was a kid. If there was a headless horseman ghost getting about, she should have known about it. Try as she might to rack her brains, she could see no logical answer to the apparition's existence. And it had her hat. Blinking, she caught sight of luminescence from the side of the clearing and wandered over to stare at the blue-glowing mushroom. Woodenly, she bent to snap the stalk and stowed it away in her pouch. Piper would be happy, but Nora would have a field day when Gretchen got back to the cottage with a bare head, a witch without a pointy hat. That was just about as bad as a witch without magic. Chapter 3. Gretchen paced the living room in the cottage as Nora and Piper worked together in the kitchen. The smell coming off the cauldron held notes of sulphur, and she heard Piper asking anxious questions in the background. "Are you sure? The teacher said—" "Don't you worry about the teacher. I know light charms inside out and back to front. When this potion is spilled, the white light pouring out of this brew will blind," Nora scoffed. Gretchen screwed her eyes shut and set her jaw. She knew she should intervene, but in the hours since being accosted in the forest, her bewilderment had fallen to rage. "Maybe we can make this tomorrow. We can go out tonight and see if the hat is anywhere, and with a few more—" "Nonsense." The sound of the cauldron swinging from its hook over the fire signalled that Nora had deemed it ready. I'll go into the classroom with you myself. I'm that certain of the outcome. Okay. Piper sounded resigned, and Gretchen stopped to meet her eye. The poor kid looked defeated, and Gretchen hoped that even with a hangover, her friend could get a light potion right. A smelly egg concoction gone wrong was the last thing Piper needed. But even if it looked on the nose, Gretchen had to admit she wasn't the one who got top marks at school. After pouring the green gloop into a sterilised bottle, Nora took her spectacles off her nose to wipe the fog from the lenses. She left the cauldron in the sink, and Gretchen wondered if she had any plans on cleaning it out in the near future. Now, this hat. Nora puffed her cheeks out and replaced the kettle to warm over the fire. Maybe we can set a guiding spell, something that will take us right to it. We'll need something cut of the same leather, though. Did you get a matching belt with it? Shoes? No. Gretchen shook her head and rubbed her chin. Aunt Esme brought it back with her from a trip to the southern continent. It was a gift for graduation. If graduation was what you could call it. Gretchen dropped out of school the moment the academy allowed it, and Aunt Esme had said it was a miracle she hadn't been cast out in disgrace. The giving of hats was fairly common for newly minted witches, and Gretchen had never thought to ask questions about its origins. Nora readied a tea tray and carried it to the table. Well, your need may be enough to make the spell work, but you must calm down. Need is a volatile substance to work with on the best of days. I just want my hat back. Gretchen dragged a hand over her face. What the heck could a ghost want with it anyway? Can't you just buy a new one? Piper brought over a bowl of oatmeal and sat at the table. There's plenty of shops in the city. Gretchen made a face, then recalled how new to witch society the girl was. It's not just a hat, kid. It's like a status symbol. I don't know. A witch wears the same hat all her life if she can keep it stitched together. Preservation spells go a long way to making that happen, but it's that worn look about them that shows everybody how long you've been in the game, like what they say about grey hair and wisdom. Nora tugged her own hat a little further down her brow and nodded her agreement. You'll have your own one day, and then you'll understand. I saved up every last coin I had from working for an alchemist in the city to buy my hat. Up early to work, then a full day of study to pass the last trials. I was desperate to have one on the day of graduation. You should have seen the look on Esther's face when I walked in wearing this. Nora's eyes shone with nostalgia, and Gretchen decided against asking who Esther was. She didn't feel like reminiscing, much less listen to someone else taking a trip down memory lane. So, not having one is embarrassing? Piper asked around a mouthful of oatmeal. Don't talk with your mouth full, and yes, getting around like this is downright mortifying. Piper rolled her eyes and gulped. So, we get another one and beat it up to make it look old? Surely magic can help with that, can't it? That hat has been with me through good times and bad. Gretchen accepted a cup of tea and took a careful sip. Without it, I don't feel like, well, me. I'm not about to give up on finding it. If that horseman had a head, he would be a danger of losing it all over again. Well, Nora pursed her lips and looked over the rim of her spectacles. You know where the best place to find answers is. The sun's up. We should all head straight to the academy, and I'll help you in the library after I've seen Piper into class. Gretchen shared a look with Piper, and despite horror at the notion of going to the academy without her hat, she knew she should go to keep Nora in line. Nora only needed half an excuse to take the entire classroom over, and if anything went wrong, the teasing would be relentless. Running both hands over her scalp, Gretchen heaved a deep breath and nodded. Good. Nora finished the rest of her tea and rummaged up her own bowl of breakfast. After eating and getting ready, and leaving Mulligan a good portion of milk as an apology for not coming through with a pixie, the three witches soared into the air toward the city, hastened by a light drizzle from low-hanging clouds. Piper hadn't put up a fuss when Gretchen insisted she ride with her, and their shared warmth was welcome as the broomsticks whistled through the air. Nora took up her position ahead, her broom coasting almost lazily along, and the wind on Gretchen's scalp whipped bitingly. While some witches imbued the buckles of their hats with protection spells and the like, Gretchen had only bothered with one spell in particular, that of keeping the darn thing on her head. Anything else, and she feared she would compromise the leather or stitching. There were horror stories of hats going up in puffs of smoke from a well-intended ward, but mostly with those youngsters who thought they could turn theirs into an arcane helmet. Its primary function was to keep her head warm and let people know who they were messing with, and the creased black leather had done the job admirably. When they touched down outside the city walls, in the official tract of land allocated to that purpose, Gretchen held back a groan. Nora wasn't appraised of the deal she had with the city stables, and the trek into the academy was long and tedious. Merchants pulled in on rambling carts, and people leaving the city caused bottlenecks at every turn. Gretchen imagined people giving her strange looks, but she told herself she was being too self-conscious. Without her hat, she might have even been mistaken for a regular, middle-aged woman, though her black dress probably gave her away while standing next to Nora. "Come on!" Nora collected Gretchen's elbow and hurried along the laneway with Piper up ahead. "School will be in soon." "Since when have you cared about being on time?" Gretchen rolled her eyes. "I'm sure the councilwomen don't give a fat froggy's bottom about keeping people waiting." "And I won't either," Nora clucked. "But first I have to get there, don't I?" Gretchen bit back a sharp remark about the likelihood of that eventuality. Despite her mood, she didn't want to crush her friend's dreams. The academy's entrance was quiet, but Gretchen knew the corridors beyond the empty hall would be teeming with students making their way to classrooms. Holding her breath as Piper pushed the heavy double doors open, Gretchen waited for the onslaught. The crowd of her peers pointing and laughing at her bare head, old crones tutting in a told-you-she-didn't-have-the-metal kind of way, but only youngsters crowded the hallways, and most seemed to be as oblivious as Piper on the importance of witches' hats. On the way to Piper's classroom, though, a cluster of witches surrounding councilwoman Beatrice Goldworthy came into view, and Gretchen's stomach twisted. "Nora!" Beatrice's wizened face cracked into a condescending smile. "Thought I'd be seeing you around before too long. A spat with the Baron, H.M.? I heard the strangest rumour that you intended to vie for council. But of course, I said that was ridiculous, and I'm nominating myself for the council seat." Nora planted her hands on her hips, and Piper shrunk against the wall, trying to avoid notice. "What of it?" Beatrice cackled, and her cronies fell into step half a second afterward. Gretchen fiddled with the end of her braid, hoping things wouldn't deteriorate into a screaming match in front of the kids. "Oh, that is precious!" Beatrice snorted. "But then, bright stars always have tickets on themselves." She wrinkled her nose and looked Gretchen up and down. "And keeping such fine company, too. Doing away with the hat, Gretchen. You always had an aversion to conformity." "Last time I checked, councilwomen were elected on merit," Nora interjected. "At least people still remember my deeds." Beatrice's bevy of sycophants recoiled, but the old woman turned her nose up in a sneer. "Brave words for a witch whose only feather in her cap is hex magic. Quite a repugnant brand of magic to be notorious for. At least I'm feared by the nobles." Nora flashed her teeth in a nasty grin. "Rather than offering myself as a doormat to wipe their boots on." Beatrice hissed, and Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose. This was not going well. Cattiness was one of the foremost reasons she avoided the academy entirely. "So, your purpose here today, then?" Beatrice cocked her head. "Come to leave hex bags under our pillows to persuade those who would vote against you?" Nora reached for Piper and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "I'm here to see Piper into class. Given her situation, I have been her tutor. She's turning in a light spell we worked on. In fact, my first order of business on the council will be to review the curriculum. The light spell instructions were really rather pedestrian." "Oh!" Beatrice guffawed and waved her arm theatrically down the hall. "The young one, I see. Well, lead on then. I wouldn't miss this for the world." Piper gave Gretchen a pleading look, but there was nothing she could do. Promising to trade some choice words with Nora for embarrassing the kid, she followed the procession toward the classroom. Standing at the head of a row of desks was a younger witch with a tight black braid and spectacles. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of their party, and she addressed Beatrice as she bowed in deference. "Councilwoman, how may I be of service?" Gretchen cast an eye around the room, where kids a few years older than Piper gawked from their seats. Potion bottles with liquid in different hues of white sat in front of them, and Gretchen felt bile rise from her stomach. Piper's potion was green. "This is Nora Brightstar, Ethel. I'm sure you haven't heard of her, but it seems she's providing guidance to one of your pupils. We've come to see the fruits of her labour." "A light spell, was it?" Beatrice pursed her lips, and poor Ethel blinked at Piper, her face bewildered. "Did you have trouble, Piper?" she asked. "If you needed help, all you had to do was ask." "Course not." Nora brought out the green potion and held it aloft. "Piper's one of the brightest students I've seen in years. We tweaked your recipe a little. Hope you don't mind." Ethel glanced at Beatrice, who nodded, then cleared her throat. "Of course, if we can just go along to the testing room." "Testing room? Pah!" Nora rolled her eyes and pressed the potion into Piper's palm. "That implies something will go wrong. Piper, you go get that spell bowl and show 'em what we've got." Piper looked to her teacher, who gave a terse nod and fetched a polished bowl from the shelves against the wall. Gretchen saw her hands shaking as she set it down on a stand for that purpose, and felt rotten to the core for letting things get that far. Hoping that Nora knew what she was talking about, Gretchen clutched her skirts with bunched fists and gritted her teeth. Piper uncorked the potion hesitantly and closed her eyes as she spilled the liquid into the bowl. As it hit the charmed surface, a white fog spilled over the side at an alarming rate. Piper grimaced and stepped back, almost engulfed in a dense mist, and the students erupted in exclamations. Tendrils went in every direction, and within seconds the room was as thick with fog as a farmer's field in midwinter. Gretchen followed the scuffling feet to the door as Ethel called for calm and asked for everyone to assemble out in the hallway. When milling figures became visible, Gretchen spotted Piper and ushered her further down the hallway away from the others. "I knew it would go wrong." Piper's eyes shone and her bottom lip trembled. "But Nora wouldn't listen." "I know, kid," Gretchen sighed. "She's not herself at the moment. I shouldn't have let her take over." Gretchen gave Piper's shoulder a squeeze and turned to search for her friend. Beatrice and her entourage blocked the way, their eyes gleaming with victory. "Let this be a lesson to all of you." Beatrice held her fist to her hips and addressed the students with her chin held high. "Improvisation invites chaos, even for those old enough to know better." The councilwoman turned to push past them, and Gretchen overheard one of them mentioning the library. Suppressing a groan, she closed her eyes and fought off the wave of frustration set to consume her. Any notion of finding answers about the headless horseman in the library was gone, and there was only one other source of obscure information she could call on in the city. "How do you feel about skipping class today?" Gretchen opened her eyes a crack and smirked. Piper's shoulders visibly loosened, but she chewed her lip as she glanced at her peers. "Won't I get in trouble?" Gretchen snorted with laughter and waved a hand. "There are times when rules are worth breaking. With the guff you're likely to get walking back in there. I'd say today is one of those days." Gretchen couldn't spot Nora anywhere, and the fog had cleared enough to see clearly. Ethel appeared to have her hands full ushering the pupils back into class, so Gretchen decided now was the time to make a break for it. With a hand on Piper's back, she urged her onward toward the most discreet route out of the academy. Chapter 4. Piper dragged her feet when she learned they were heading for Elod's Emporium, but thankfully she didn't shrink as much as the last time they visited, when they strode into the gloomy shop of arcane curiosities. Gretchen twisted her handkerchief into both nostrils to keep from sneezing, though strangely, Elod didn't appear to cause her wizard allergy much grief. It was a question for another day, though. If there was a tally of such things, Gretchen was already in the man's debt. The wizard himself stood on a ladder toward the back of the shop, sorting through items which looked as though they'd sat there for decades. With what looked to be a mouldering stuffed squirrel in one hand, he called a greeting and climbed down from his work. "You should really have someone around to help you with that kind of thing. Ladders are a dangerous business." Gretchen offered a wide smile and leaned against the counter. "So are the items atop said ladder," Elod grumbled as he shuffled back to his chair. "One should never send an apprentice to do a wizard's work. What can I help you with today, Gretchen Mirkwood? A new hat, perhaps?" I was robbed. A ghost took my hat, out in the forest by Edgewood." Gretchen rubbed a hand over her scalp and shifted her feet. Come again? Elod's bushy eyebrows knitted together and he leaned a little closer over the desk. I thought I heard you say ghost. I was just as surprised. Gretchen threw her hands up. I've only ever known one ghost capable of moving objects, and he was a nutjob. But even a wraith can't use its hands. And I saw my hat swinging from this one's saddle after he plucked it right off my head. Saddle? He had a mount? Elod rubbed his chin. A ghost mount. And it didn't have a head, if that means anything. The horse or its rider? Elod eyed her askance, and Gretchen paused to find the words to explain the situation more clearly, lest the wizard think she'd lost her marbles. The rider? I was out at night foraging for glowing mushrooms. I heard hoofbeats, except they would suddenly stop. It wasn't until I got to the road leading to one of the old mines that I saw it, as ghost-looking as any other dead folk you see around. Then it galloped by me and snatched my hat. Gretchen glanced at Piper, who reached to clasp her hand, and she was glad her ward didn't think she was crazy. Interesting, Elod murmured, then stood to pluck a book from a nearby shelf. I haven't heard of your horseman, but there are accounts of cursed ones left to rot in the world until they've satisfied the terms of their curse. Not proper ghosts, you see, but even after their bones have turned to dust, they remain. Cursed? Gretchen blinked. That's one heck of a hex to put on someone. Indeed, they have forbidden the practice for centuries. Elod thumbed through the pages. I doubt there's even a person alive with the knowledge to cast that sort of spell. Gretchen wondered absently what Nora may know of such things, then pushed the thought away. She was still annoyed with her friend, and she didn't want to think about the drama of the witches' council. So how does one track down a cursed soul to demand their property back? And why is it in the forest anyhow? I grew up there, and never once have I seen this guy. Could be that the fellow has only just arrived. Elod squinted at the page in his book. But I have an account of a ghost 3 centuries ago, a matron who overturned mattresses in every tavern in the city for months, only to find a strand of pearls one night and erupt in a ball of light. The wizard Norrie surmised that she found the cursed object that tied her to the realm of the living, and thus was freed. Well, how come they take so long then? Gretchen puzzled over the logic of it all. If they've been around long enough for their corpses to disintegrate, that's a whole lot of time to find whatever they're looking for. Norrie had some thoughts on that too. Elod tapped the page with his index finger. That perhaps they cannot exhume themselves and must wait until they are freed from their flesh. The notion is sound. Otherwise we would be plagued with these unfortunates. Sheesh. Gretchen made a face. What a way to go. There may be someone old enough to know about curses. Piper glanced sheepishly at Elod, then focused on Gretchen. What about Mabel? Gretchen blinked, trying to figure out who the kid was talking about when it dawned on her. Is that Harridan still stalking the academy? She was a relic when I was at school. Ah, good mind, girl. She could be of use. Elod smoothed his moustaches and nodded. I haven't had the pleasure, but understand she has been a resident at the academy for half a millennium. Gretchen wasn't a fan of Mabel. The ghost lingered beyond death, in her estimation, to give students a hard time and listen in on conversations that were none of her business. After considering it, she decided she wasn't that desperate. Yet. I've got my own ghost buddies back home. Maybe they can help me track it. She didn't want to admit her other idea, which involved dipping into what forbidden knowledge her spellbook contained on death magic. I would appreciate a written account of what you discover. Elod gave a lopsided smile. Even if you cannot recover your hat. She supposed she owed it to the guy. Whenever she called in asking questions, he happily answered, even if she wasn't a paying customer. Sure. Gretchen patted Piper's shoulder. Piper here can write it up. Apprentices need to learn somehow, don't they? Elod chuckled, and Piper's face flushed a shade of rosy pink. I would be much obliged. He inclined his head and produced a bauble from the pocket of his drab grey robes. I always pay for good information. The more detail, the better. Piper's eyes widened as the gem gleamed and nodded hurriedly. Gretchen wasn't sure she wanted to know what the stone did, but knowing Elod, it would be something out of the ordinary. Well, thanks for the chat. I'm sure I'll be stopping by again soon. Elod's eyes twinkled and he showed them to the door. Unplugging the handkerchief from her nose as they crossed the threshold, Gretchen wondered absently why he'd never asked her about it. From the first day she'd walked into the Emporium, Elod had shown an uncanny amount of knowledge about the Mirkwood family, and if her allergy was hereditary, perhaps she could learn something useful about it. But first she needed her hat back, and with the drizzle letting up, it was time to get back to Edgewood, where she hoped the ghosts that frequented the Salton Bog had finished their day's work. "So, you'll ask Reg about the Horseman?" Piper asked, bringing Gretchen out of her reverie. "I guess." Gretchen puffed out her cheeks, and they turned at the end of the street toward the stables. "Not that I look forward to working with the guy, but Alfred's probably our better bet. He's been a ghost longer than any of 'em." "But what do they know about curses?" "The curse isn't my problem, kid. All I want is my hat back. If they can help me find this guy, I'll try a freezing potion I saw a while ago and reclaim what's mine." They walked on in silence, but when Gretchen glanced down, she saw the cogs turning in Piper's mind. When the stable was in sight, the girl evidently came to some conclusion and spoke up. "If this is a curse, it's a magical problem. And because you found it, aren't you obligated to fix it as a member of the guild?" Gretchen ground to a halt and her jaw dropped. "Are you serious? You're going to pull the guild card on me? My obligations are for those magical problems that pose a public hazard. Nobody has come complaining to me about this headless horseman. The only person it's terrorized is me." "It could be dangerous." Piper's face was deadly serious. "If we don't do something about it and a person from Edgewater goes into the forest, we'd be culpable." Gretchen ground her teeth. It figured that one of the first things on the Academy's curriculum would be public liability. "Look, let's just go see what we can find out. And after I get my hat back, we can figure out what's next. If the matter isn't urgent, maybe we can get it assigned to someone else to clean up. It's an interesting case, if you're into that kind of thing. There are plenty of witches out there who want to make a name for themselves." Piper held her gaze for a few seconds, then drew a deep breath and nodded. Sometimes Gretchen wondered who was parenting who in their relationship. Continuing onward, they made their way to the back of the stables and into the air, headed toward Edgewater. The Salton Bog earned its name as the pair tracked through mud toward the back door. With the shift in season in full swing, the ground squelched underfoot, and while the low-hanging clouds didn't look ominous, persistent light showers kept the sun from piercing through. Scraping their boots, Gretchen led the way into the tavern, wariness seeping into her belly. Familiar sounds of raucous laughter indicated the regulars were already making merry. And without her hat, Gretchen felt like she was about to walk in naked. Smoothing her braid, she chided herself for not having at least picked up something temporary in the city, then pushed through the swinging doors behind the bar. Jürgen paused from collecting empty mugs, and his face fell when he met her gaze. Ogres and wood elves dropped their conversations to stare. Gnomes chortled with laughter, but it was Reginald, the mouthiest of the ghosts who frequented the bar to drink ethereal spirits, who made the first jeer. "What do we have here? A witch without her pointed hat? That's downright indecent if you ask me." He snorted with laughter, which set off the peanut gallery. "But I must say, without that battered old thing, you look 10 years younger. Sets off those blue eyes rather well, don't you think, boys?" Gretchen's cheeks burned, and she wondered if bringing Piper along had been a good idea. The girl rolled her eyes and folded her arms, and Gretchen figured she'd better say something before Reg's taunts became too lewd. Gretchen pitched her voice loud enough to be heard over the clamouring and rounded the bar. What was indecent was being accosted by a headless ghost out in the forest, except this guy's hands worked just fine, took a poor old woman's hat and went racing off on his horse. "Anyone here know anything about him?" That slowed down the laughter some, and the wood elves traded words in hushed whispers, while Reg gawked. Speechless for once, it seemed. "There have been sightings of this apparition." The lyrical voice of a female wood elf sliced through the noise of the bar. "But it dares not enter our grove. We have not interfered with its passing. Its aura reeks of foul magic." Dire warnings were better than ignorant silence in Gretchen's estimation, and as she waved Piper over to take the topic up with the elves, Reg spoke up. "We've seen him too, though how a ghost can talk without a head is well past my comprehension." Gretchen held a finger up to the elves with a polite smile to indicate she'd be with them in a moment, and turned to the band of ghosts. If they could have blanched, she was sure they would have, with their features etched with worry as they hovered above their seats. "You've spoken to the guy?" Gretchen plucked a stool from under Carl and dusted it off before setting it in front of Piper. Then she commandeered Reg's seat and laced her fingers together. "What can you tell me?" "I told you I saw the fellow pluck an apple from the tree," Alfred hissed. "And none of you louts believed me." Reg waved the older ghost to silence and took a healthy gulp of his liquor. "We saw him a few weeks back, out by McBride's orchard." "What did it say?" Gretchen tapped her boot on the floorboards, hoping she wouldn't have to pry out every morsel of information from the guy. "Wanted to know about some kind of curse. Reckoned there was a witch about who hid his head. He was right strange, like those hermits who shun everyone. Didn't want to chat or know where to get a good mug of this." He gestured with his drink and shrugged. "And wouldn't abide questions about his mount. Never once seen a spectre drag his horse with him to the afterlife." "His head?" Gretchen leaned forward. "He needs to find his head. What did he say about the witch who cursed him?" "Nothing," Reg shrugged. "Told him the only witch I knew versed in that kind of mumbo-jumbo was Nora Brightstar." Gretchen's eyes boggled, and she wondered if the ghost had mistaken her for Nora. She scraped her chair back and stood. "Come on, kid." "But—" Her small face screwed up, and she looked between the ghosts. "Shouldn't we find out more first? If the ghost is trying to track down Nora, we need to warn her." "But Nora didn't hex him," Piper protested. "I doubt this guy knows that. And if it was my hat last time," Gretchen drew a thumb across her neck, "Nora could be in a lot of trouble." Chapter 5. Gretchen sagged with relief to find Nora nursing a mug of witch's brew at the kitchen table back at the cottage. Then her feelings turned bitter as she thought about the morning's catastrophe. "I wasn't sure when you two would be back." Nora gave an anxious chuckle and grimaced. "I really messed up your class, Piper. My head has been in the clouds lately." "Or up your backside," Gretchen snorted. "Now, I've seen some things in my time, but that little display was like two wizards comparing spellbooks. You owe Piper a proper apology." Nora's eyes glistened, but as she nodded, Piper rolled her eyes. "Later. We have bigger problems now. Tell her about the Horseman." "The Horseman?" Nora chewed her lip. "I thought I caught sight of something from the air when I flew back. A blur, really, but it was at the edge of the forest." Gretchen hung her cloak on a hook by the door, and Piper sat at the table. Ordering her thoughts, Gretchen recounted their day's movements, with what they learned along the way. "So, if this guy has been waiting in his grave to come and seek vengeance, you probably have a target on your back." "I have heard about these kinds of curses. Theoretically, I can assure you. They were in vogue for a time until folks realized how problematic the dead could be. Some of the remaining tombs were reinforced, but those measures could only ever be temporary." Nora wrinkled her nose. "But cursing ahead is particularly macabre. The Academy recovered some known items. Under tight security now, council-level stuff." "So what then? Head in a pickling jar? We just file a claim with the council, like lost property or something?" "I doubt it." Nora stood to put the kettle over the hearth. "I didn't come across this information in the library. Let's just say I took a peek at a book behind the velvet curtains." There were no velvet curtains in the library, but Gretchen took her meaning. "Why would they keep it secret? Shouldn't they be trying to undo the curses?" Piper nibbled at a cookie she produced from her pocket. Nora made a face as she readied tea leaves. "My best guess is, it's political. Hush-hush from the wizards, if you know what I mean. Witches weren't always bottom of the rung in the magical world. In times gone past, witches and wizards stood as equals. But wizards were never much good at hexes and curses, and it was their guild who led the push to outlaw the most grievous of them." Gretchen had always thought stories of witch and wizard equality were overinflated at best. She couldn't fathom a world where witches weren't scorned by regular folk. "The history is muddy," Nora continued, "but the accounts I read in the council's archives all hint that curses were the tipping point to the wizard's ascension. They may have the upper hand with destructive magic, but I'd say those old buffoons were shaking in their boots as curses became more commonplace." Gretchen choked on her words at the mention of the council's archive and shook her head in an attempt to wrangle them. "The archive? Hold up just a minute and tell me how the heck you got in there." Nora's smile was smug as she carried over the tea tray, and she waggled her eyebrows. Aunt Delilah was keen for me to carry on the family tradition. Thought it would put me in good stead to study the archives ahead of time, a good 20 years ago now. And Gretchen thought she was irreverent when it came to academy law. She supposed the archive also contained the background on the Tooth Fairy's realm, and the spiders that spun their webs between the portals. But that was a topic for another time. So we can't go to the council to ask if they have any spare heads lying around on account of you incriminating yourself. That's if they even have it. And if it's not there, we don't know who cursed this guy to begin with. Gretchen's eyes flickered to the rug in the living room. I suppose the only way to find that out is to ask this guy ourselves. Nora followed her gaze and pushed her spectacles further up the bridge of her nose. She'd been there the night Gretchen had learned about the darker magic her spellbook contained, and zombie raising aside, it was clear one of her ancestors dealt in death magic. If they could summon and contain the Horseman, dabbling in necromancy could be worth the risk. Bad idea, Nora folded her arms. These spirits aren't your usual sort. What? Piper frowned and stared at the spot where they kept the spellbook. Are there ghost spells in there? I'm not sure. Gretchen went to retrieve the book from under the loose board beneath the rug, but at least one of my ancestors seemed to be interested in death. And last time you took a chance on one of those spells, you raised a zombie, Nora tutted. Zombie? Piper gulped. But isn't that kind of magic forbidden? The Academy may throw out decrees whenever they like. Gretchen brushed dust from the spellbook's cover. But they can't erase thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. And if you get caught... Piper followed Gretchen to the desk. Unless I committed a regular crime, the worst they could do would be to tear up my membership. They have jurisdiction to imprison witches who fall afoul of the common law, but fortunately there was enough sense among the guild to prevent the council from overreaching. Of course, being cast out is a fate worse than death for some, but me... Gretchen snorted. Well, I just figure it's always been a matter of time before it happens. She wouldn't be able to practice magic legally, Nora explained. Not for any gain whatsoever. Even selling a pie made with magically grown pumpkins would be considered a punishable crime. I'd like to see him prove something like that. Gretchen undid the laces of her spellbook and gave the tome a pat. But don't worry, kid. There are always tables to wait at the Salt and Bog if that ever happened. I've come to think of it as a not-quite retirement plan. And what does Uncle Jurgen think about that? Piper's eyes crinkled with amusement, and Gretchen was glad to see the girl lose the serious mood. I'm counting on him being furious. After a week of breaking crockery, he'll be in a foul enough mood to front the Witches' Council on my behalf. Piper giggled, and Gretchen bit back a smirk as she opened the spellbook. Nora's footfalls in the background sounded like pacing, but the fact she wasn't outright arguing was enough. The more she thought about this ghost, the more worried she became. What if it wasn't just after her hat? The way it swung that axe when she went to retrieve it mid-aid sent chills down her spine. Perhaps without a head, it was looking to return the favour to as many witches as he could. Clearing her throat, Gretchen willed herself to calm. I need to know how to summon and bind a ghost. The spellbook's restive hum turned to a vibration that rattled the desk. Cold seeped from the pages and the room darkened. It was a little melodramatic for Gretchen's liking, but she held herself rigid, waiting for words to appear. When they did, much quicker than the last time she inquired on death magic, the same dense script filled the page. She thumbed through the tome and found it once again filled with lore and rituals. There, Gretchen clucked. An entire book filled with the stuff. Now we just need to find something that'll work. Curiosity must have won out over reluctance, and Nora peered over Gretchen's shoulder. Have you any idea which of your ancestors recorded this? None whatsoever. Gretchen shrugged. We aren't short of a spell book in the Mirkwood family. Cordelia has most of the others. This one was my grandmother's. Nora reached out tentatively. Do you mind if I... Sure, Gretchen stepped back. Have at it. Witches weren't usually in the habit of sharing their spell books with others, but Gretchen was more than happy to offload research. Piper crowded in beside Nora to look over the text, and Gretchen's stomach gurgles reminded her of the hour. The last echoes of daylight strained in through the windows, So she went to the kitchen to fix them all some sandwiches and finish the last of her cooling tea. It was only after Gretchen had wolfed down her dinner and seen to Mulligan's that Nora called out and brought the spellbook to the table. Now, I'm not completely sure this will work. Cursed souls are a different ilk after all, but this summoning spell seems safe, and the binding not overly complicated. She picked up a sandwich and chewed over the book, while Gretchen tried not to grind her teeth at the thought of crumbs collecting in the spine. Mostly rune-based, though how we could execute it out in the woods with chalk will be tricky. The woods! Piper's eyes brightened. Maybe I can get some more mushrooms. Taking Piper out to confront a ghost with a grudge wasn't the soundest idea in Gretchen's mind, but given Piper's woes with the last potion, she couldn't bring herself to deny the girl. So long as Nora promises not to go within spitting distance of the cauldron once we're back, Gretchen held up a warning finger, though she can take notes on how one of these light thingamajigs works, from the superior sorceress. The chagrined look on Nora's face was worth it when Piper grinned from ear to ear. It wasn't far off the mark, either. It had surprised Gretchen how quickly the kid had taken to cauldron craft. I suppose that's fair, Nora conceded. Do you have any amber we can use as a focal point? Gretchen blinked, wondering what amber had to do with light charms, then realised Nora was talking about the summoning. Ah, maybe. Let me go check. Not having much use for more ritualised magic, Gretchen kept what limited stones she had on hand in the dresser in her bedroom. She knew Nora's collection was extensive, but going to the salt and bog to retrieve them would be a pain. Rummaging through amethysts, obsidian, fluorite and quartz, Gretchen came up with nothing even close to amber. Then she recalled a spell she'd cast a while back to rid the cottage of vermin, and the unfortunate explosion that sent her ingredients up in a puff of smoke. Crap, Gretchen muttered, but her hand lingered on the quartz, which minded her of the night out in the forest. Scratching the back of her head, Gretchen tracked back out to the kitchen and shook her head. No amber, but the place where I encountered the ghost. It was the quartz road toward the mines. Nora gave an appreciative nod and rubbed her chin. Quartz doesn't have a lot of juice on its own, but in that kind of quantity it could be useful. It would take a lot of work, but if we used gravel to mark the runes, the spell could be rather powerful. Given the strength of this apparition, we need every ounce of power we can manage, Gretchen agreed. Glancing at Piper, her stomach churned at what she was about to suggest. Her concern for the girl when they first met was others would misuse her considerable raw power. We can link our strength to make sure of it. Chapter 6. The moon shone brighter than the night Gretchen had scoured the forest for mushrooms. While it didn't bode well for Piper's foraging, Gretchen was glad for the extra light. Every twig snapping underfoot had her heart hammering, waiting for the echo of hoofbeats to ring out. They didn't come, and while it was quite a hike, they made it to the gravel road unhindered by the dead. Each of them wrangled empty buckets to move gravel around, and Nora nodded in satisfaction at the clearing where they agreed to mark the runes. This should do just nicely. She stepped out a circle and dropped rocks at equal points. The only trouble is whether we call on someone else entirely. I doubt there are many other ghosts getting around in the forest, Gretchen shrugged. Unless the spell is powerful enough to suck Reg and his pals over from the salt and bog. Let's hope not. Nobody in their right mind would summon those louts willingly. Did you get his name by chance? Nora grabbed a nearby stick and scratched marks in the bare earth. We didn't stay long enough, Piper griped. She wanted to check on you right away. It wasn't something Gretchen would have confessed, and the admission had her feeling a little sheepish. Once I heard those idiots had given the ghost your name, well, it got me wondering if my hat was all this guy was after. Nora paused, and her eyes softened. Then she looked around the clearing. It's a wonder we haven't seen or heard anything, unless 3 witches are enough to give him pause. Piper scuffed her boot through the dirt. If a witch cursed his head, does that mean she cut it off too? It was something Nora must have considered, as she answered before Gretchen could picture such a thing occurring. It's an interesting dilemma. The curse must have been performed post-mortem, but before the soul moved beyond the veil. Very precise stuff, and given our ghost is headless, I would hazard a guess that decapitation was the cause of death. Nora's lip twitched. Taking off a head is harder than it looks. I would say either the witch performed said curse at the killer's behest, or the witch ordered the killing. Hard to say which. Either proposition was decidedly grisly, and Gretchen was glad they outlawed the practice. Yuck, Piper hugged her arms. I wonder what other creepy things we'll find with the head. That's if we find it, Nora sighed. From what I can put together, they hid these cursed objects as far from the remains as possible. And given what we're dealing with here, it seems there was more ill will for the fellow than usual. I wonder what he did, Piper ventured. What any of them did, really. Maybe they did awful things to witches, or to people witches cared about. Humph, Nora shook her head. Whatever it was, punishing someone beyond death is selfish. It's left a legacy for others to deal with, and more people could end up hurt because of it. Now let's get to work before it shows up. It'll do none of us any good to get trampled while asking questions. The work of scooping hard-packed gravel and hauling it back to the circle left Gretchen with jagged nails and a twinge in her lower back. Nora arranged each line with close attention to detail, and when they were almost done, a cloud passed by the moon, bathing the white quartz in light. Gretchen thought she might have imagined it, but as the line of the circle closed, the quartz glowed brighter. Nora stepped around the boundary, muttering incantations under her breath, and Piper watched on, taking in every detail. The spell sent a shiver up Gretchen's spine, and she cast around as boughs creaked together in a gust of wind. Nora stopped by the tangle of thorns where the ghost had dissipated and held out both hands in an invitation to link. Last-minute doubt weighed Gretchen's feet, but she swallowed and offered Piper a nervous smile as they made their way to Nora. With Nora leading the ritual, their job was to lend strength and power, and as Gretchen clasped Nora's hand, she let her barriers slide down in deference. Nora's practised hand drew magic steadily, like a thread from a bobbin, and with Piper on the other side, their powers fused and filled the clearing with crackling energy. I call the cursed horseman to this circle, the spectre without a head, doomed to wander the lands until his terms are met. Heed our call. Nora spoke with authority, and repeated the words again with a fresh burst of power. A horse's scream sounded on the gravel road, and the thundering hoofbeats were irregular, like the beast was struggling against the pull. Nora kept up the thrumming power, and used it to amplify her voice against the wind whistling through the trees. Come now, and answer for the curse that chains you. Reveal to us who damned you in death, and bring about your proper end. Nora squeezed Gretchen's hand and stood straighter. Defy us at your peril, fight the call, and I'll only bind you tighter. Hoofbeats drew closer, and Nora bolstered the spell with more power drawn from the link. Gretchen's legs felt like they might give out at any second, but the headless horseman crashed into the clearing, and his mount leapt into the circle in an ungainly motion. Quartz flared with brilliant white light, and a different scream pierced the night. Sounding as though it reverberated right through the dark suit of armour, it was undeniably the voice of the rider. "Filthy sorceresses!" he growled. "Isn't it enough that I'm damned? Must you make me a slave too? We summon you to learn of your demise, nothing more." Nora allowed the link to fade and stepped forward, and to ask that you return Gretchen's hat. Gretchen narrowed her eyes at the horseman's saddle, where her hat remained slung. What use a ghost could have of it was beyond her reckoning, but it sounded like all witches were in the guy's bad books. "Why would I offer you anything, hag?" the horseman spat. "Knowledge or trinkets?" Gretchen poked a thumb in Nora's direction. "Well, she seems to be interested in a trade. I just want my property back. I have ideas if you don't offer something up. They won't be pleasant, but I'm not averse to getting my hands dirty." "Hush!" Nora barked. "Even with the hat returned, I won't have you terrorising the lands with your restless presence. Who cursed you, and what item do you seek?" The horse reared, and the rider roared with bitter laughter. "Is it not obvious?" He gestured to his missing head. "That reunification with my earthly remains will put me to rest." Gretchen huffed and rolled her eyes. The ghosts had already told them that at the Salton Bog, and she didn't much care for trading barbed remarks. "The witch," Nora insisted. "With her name, I may be able to locate it." The horseman's mount skittered within the confines of the circle, and he took a moment before replying. "Zita Goldworthy," he sneered. "That hag had me executed because I refused her niece. It surprises me not that they swept it from the public record." "Goldworthy?" Nora turned to arch an eyebrow at Gretchen. "And how long has it been since your, death?" "I was a knight to King Vernon II, Sir Jack Murray of Ravensglade. The years sealed in a tomb mean nothing to me." "King Vernon," Nora muttered. Her brow creased as she reckoned with the timeline. 2 centuries at least. "It feels much longer," Sir Jack said. "Half an eternity, more like." Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose. This was only getting worse. If the witch responsible for cursing the guy was an ancestor of Councilwoman Beatrice Goldworthy, and Nora needed to plunder the council's vault. "All right, that settles it." Gretchen sighed and walked toward the circle. "What did the book have to say about twisting a ghost's arm, or even keeping him still so I can—" "Stop!" Nora screeched. "Go in there and you'll unravel the binding. This is good news. Zita was from Helgard, which means the council must have her effects." "Oh, she was from Helgard," Sir Jack agreed. "Thought she was royalty as head of the council. Had designs to marry off as many witches as she could into noble houses." Gretchen groaned and made a face at Nora. "See, this guy is unhinged? Now, nobody ever accused me of paying attention in school, but even I know there was never a chairwoman Zita Goldsworthy." "Yes, there was." Nora's voice was quiet. "There were only ever 3 witches wiped from the records. Zita was one of them. Even in the council's vault they didn't list her crimes." "Oh, well, that's just fantastic." Gretchen threw up her arms. "My hat is right here, but now we're in the middle of some stupid cover-up as juicy as a boil about to burst." "Looks like it." Nora's mouth curved into a small smile. "It seems we've a council meeting to gate crash." "You can't mean to leave me here." Sir Jack's deep voice faltered. Gretchen swung around and levelled a finger at the apparition. "Are you going to hand over the hat?" Sir Jack stroked the worn leather as he considered his position and apparently decided the hat was his only bargaining chip. "I shall await your return." "Darn right you will." Gretchen gritted her teeth and resigned herself to a cold scalp on the trip back to the cottage. "Can we look for some more mushrooms quickly?" Piper folded her arms with a shiver. "Not tonight, kid. All you'll catch out here is a cold." She patted the girl's shoulder. "Besides, the moon is too bright. Makes spotting them that much harder." "But she's right," Nora agreed. "Perhaps when we come back." Piper gave them both a dark look, but despite feeling like she owed the kid one after the disaster at school, they had a bigger problem on their hands. And Gretchen would make it her business to make sure the slithering tendrils of political intrigue didn't touch her ward. Chapter 7. Gretchen felt like a knight without armour going into the council's hall without her hat, and would have given anything to be back at the Salt and Bog, where Piper was likely sulking at being left out. The fact the old hags were meeting the night after summoning Jack seemed less like convenience and more like spooky coincidence, especially with Nora wielding wild accusations against the Goldworthy clan. In any case, the double doors to their hall remained firmly shut. And with rumours of Nora vying for a place at the table, Gretchen reckoned they were in for a long wait. Likely, whatever was being discussed was completely innocuous. Perhaps who won at cards last week, or Nora's entire witch history was being dredged up in readiness for a war of words. Puffing out her cheeks and leaning back against the hard ladder-back chair left in the hall, Gretchen felt another twinge of guilt over the look Cordelia had given her before slipping into the meeting hall. Instead of dropping the bomb in the meeting, they should have gone to see her first to explain what happened. As the Vice-Chancellor, she couldn't have done much in this situation, but it would have been the right thing to do. They might not exactly be best pals, but their relationship had improved in recent times. It was about time Gretchen was the one offering olive branches. Nora must have thought pacing was a little too undignified, but she couldn't sit still either. She'd considered the portraits on the wall a dozen times, and was staring at a particularly unfavourable likeness of the former chair of the council, Lana Thorncrow, when the double doors swung open. Cordelia glanced between the pair and pursed her lips. "The council will see you both." She quirked an eyebrow at Gretchen. "Are you sure you want to go in there without a hat?" Gretchen stood and ran a hand over her scalp, and though she thought wearing something was better than nothing, the very idea of donning something else felt traitorous. Nah, let's just get this over with. Nora set her jaw with determination and strode through the doors without a word. Cordelia turned to let Gretchen close the door behind them, and the warmth of the blazing hearth against her shoulders felt awfully like a spotlight on her back. The council table was figurative in the Witches' Academy. Rather than sitting on imposing chairs, craning over maps and documents, the 12 council women sat on plush, upholstered wingbacks, arranged in the rough approximation of a circle. Deference seemed appointed to those seated closest to the fire, with members on the other side of the room heaped under knitted blankets. One chair sat empty against the wall, that of the late Gwendolen Blight. In the stifling close air, Gretchen puffed out her cheeks and refrained from fanning her face. Chairwoman Marian Inglewood sat nearest to the fire, a formidable elder who stood as Chancellor of the Academy, when Gretchen was a pupil. Nora Brightstar. The chairwoman's reedy voice brooked no nonsense. What brings you here this night demanding an audience? I suppose she's here to make her intention to run for council known, Beatrice scoffed from her place further from the fire. Though why she needs to bring along a friend to hold her hand, one without so much as a hat, is anyone's guess. A snicker from the crones had Gretchen grinding her teeth, but it was Nora's opportunity to offer a rebuke, and she knew her friend was more than up to the task. While I'm sure there isn't much else that consumes your thoughts, Councilwoman Beatrice, tonight I'm here to bring a matter of grave importance to your attention. Nora held her chin up, and the wheezy giggles slowed to silence from the other members. When Chairwoman Inglewood nodded for Nora to continue, she cleared her throat and clasped her hands behind her back. While this admission is uncomfortable and perhaps even incriminating, I am compelled to speak for a greater purpose. There is a cursed soul on the loose in this kingdom, who only recently escaped his grave. Nora paused for a moment to look around at the wizened faces before continuing. I know about the cursed items in the council's keeping. My Aunt Delilah allowed me to peruse the texts in the archive. What I ask is that the cursed item be handed over, so we may put this damned soul to rest. This is outrageous! Beatrice flew up from her seat and snarled. Never in all my years have I seen such a brazen attempt at strong-arming a seat at the council table, using forbidden knowledge and fear-mongering to elbow her way in. Chairwoman Inglewood held up a hand for silence, but her face was a mask of cold fury. We aren't in the habit of handing over dangerous items to lawbreakers. If I were you, I'd start talking quickly about this cursed soul. Well, that actually has a lot more to do with me. Gretchen stepped forward and fiddled with the end of her braid. The headless horseman, Sir Jack apparently, accosted me in the woods by Edgewater and made off with my hat. We were able to, communicate with him last night, and he spoke of being cursed close to 200 years ago. Headless, Chairwoman Inglewood sat a little straighter. I'm assuming this Jack was an apparition. Well, that's where it gets interesting, yeah. Gretchen wasn't sure if she should hand the reins back over to Nora or not. It was the head that was apparently cursed. Gretchen shifted where she stood, and muttering erupted between council members. Chairwoman Inglewood seemed to stare past her, and Gretchen looked to Cordelia with a sheepish shrug. Her sister's face was ashen, and Gretchen wondered if her sister was privy to the cursed object collection. But it was Beatrice's reaction which was of most interest, and Gretchen cast surreptitious glances at the woman who had sat after her earlier outburst. Instead of outrage or surprise, her eyes held a glint of fear, and Gretchen decided that everything Jack had said about the Goldworthy family must be true. But Chairwoman Inglewood's eyebrows furrowed with what looked like worry. It was always hard to tell with the wrinkles upon wrinkles, and that didn't bode well for a simple solution. If they didn't have the head, they were up a fouled stream without a paddle, and Gretchen would have to concede defeat and get a new hat. There was a new leathersmith in the city anyhow. After Ewan had been busted for slavery, the hole in the leathersmith industry hadn't taken long to patch up, and Reardon's wares looked decent. Gretchen was considering whether a new hat with purple leather might look especially smart, when she realised people were talking again, and that she should be paying attention. possibility that the ghost was being untruthful. Chairwoman Inglewood drew a deep breath through her nose. I am the keeper of the cursed items, and can assure you there are no heads among them, and how such a thing could be achieved is frankly baffling. Nora held her ground, and Gretchen knew the next part would be nasty, but even if Beatrice had the head in her possession, Gretchen figured she would never admit to such a thing publicly. Fortunately, our man spoke of the witch who cursed him, Zita Goldworthy, who, if I recall correctly, was an authority on hex magic. I've gleaned a lot from her work in the library, Nora said. Beatrice recoiled as if struck, and wheezy exclamations erupted from the other council members. Cordelia only closed her eyes with a pained expression, no doubt annoyed at what political fallout would come of the meeting. "She dares to slander the Goldworthy name," Beatrice screeched, "to drag me down into the mud so she can position herself to take a chair she's unworthy of. She's so bent on her own rise, she would step on her own ancestors to get there." Nora's face turned an ugly shade of purple, but she turned to address Chairwoman Inglewood instead of spitting vitriol back at Beatrice. "I made no secret of my plans to nominate for the council. I still believe I would offer strength to this circle and bring about much-needed reform." Nora paused to let the council members grumble over the remark, then continued, "But I am at a crossroads, as you all well know, and it has become clear that my work in the world is not yet done." Chairwoman Inglewood held up her hand to silence muttering from the others, and her reedy voice was nevertheless thick with authority. "You show about as much tact as a stampeding bull, Nora Brightstar. If you have a point, you'd better make it before we all expire." "Of course," Nora bobbed her head in deference. "It's clear the council has a problem, one which requires a deft hand with curses and discretion in putting to bed what should have been dealt with long ago. Hexes are my bread and butter. Instead of sealing tombs and hoping to put off the inevitable, I propose to be an agent to the council, undo the mistakes of the past, and put the unfortunates to permanent rest." Gretchen watched the council members carefully, and her nerves remained steady as they sat quietly, considering. What Nora proposed was a solution to a problem. It was news to her, but she supposed Nora's ambition made a certain kind of sense. Gretchen figured, if they turned her down, it would be a matter of cutting off their warty noses to spite their haggard faces. The air in the room felt close, and Gretchen struggled to stand still as she waited for someone to speak. "That's all very well, child." Chairwoman Inglewood stood with a grunt to warm her hands by the flames. "But how do you propose to end a curse without the object in question? Makes your proposal seem flimsy to me." Nora opened her mouth, then clicked her teeth shut. The council members began sniggering, and Gretchen winced. How the heck were they supposed to figure out where a cursed head, lopped off centuries past, was located? Then Piper's voice rang in her ears, and Gretchen stepped forward, holding a finger up. "Mabel," she announced. The single word silenced the room, and encouraged, Gretchen continued. "If anyone around here knows about a secret buried centuries ago, it's that old spectre. Where is she, anyway? I would have thought she'd make it her business to haunt council meetings." It was Councilwoman Hattie that spoke up, casting a sour look in the corners of the room. "We keep our meetings warded. She's presumptuous enough to think she's an honorary member of the council. Even if we were inclined to offer her that kind of position, she can't be trusted to keep her trap shut." It made sense to Gretchen, who knew she wasn't an outlier in her aversion to the busybody ghost, but she figured her logic was sound as she nodded to Nora, and her pal looked relieved. Before she could take up where Gretchen left off, though, Beatrice protested. "The matter is highly sensitive." Her shrill voice startled more than a few of her colleagues. "And you call this discreet? Asking the biggest gossip in this building about magical practices long since forgotten?" "Enough." Chairwoman Inglewood held up her hand. "Tell me what threat this spirit poses." "I cannot keep Sir Jack placated much longer." Nora shrugged and shined her nails on her sleeve. "If he can't have peace, he will seek vengeance. Any woman with a pointy hat will do, and his axe is rather sharp." "She's lying!" Beatrice bristled. "I'll wager this ghost has been conjured from her imagination." "There's a way to verify Sir Jack's existence." Nora smirked. "I have the right to call for testimony from another guildswoman when accused of wrongdoing, Mabel Highmarch." A strangled sound from Beatrice told Gretchen that Nora had been making use of at least some of her free time reading bylaws. Muttering came from the others, but Chairwoman Inglewood nodded and waved to Cordelia. "She's right. Go fetch Mabel, would you, Cordelia?" Gretchen rarely saw her sister taking orders and obeying meekly, but Cordelia did as she was bidden. Rather than observe the glaring contest between Beatrice and Nora, Gretchen busied herself by brushing imagined dust from her skirts, then saw herself to a seat by the wall. She caught Chairwoman Inglewood giving her the side-eye, but Gretchen figured it was plain rude not to have offered a seat before now, anyway. It wasn't long before Cordelia returned, and muttered an incantation at the threshold to lower the wards. Mabel's ethereal form bobbed behind her, and she glanced eagerly into the room, not bothering to hide her excitement at being called in by the council. "Well, well, need a fresh set of eyes on something, ladies?" Mabel guffawed. "Or perhaps a pair that have seen a few things over the years?" Mabel cackled at her imagined wit, and Gretchen rolled her eyes as the ghost streamed through Cordelia to enter the room. She just hoped the old bat knew something useful. Chapter 8. Not only was Mabel a general busybody, she had an aura of smugness that she carried with her wherever she went. Gretchen was convinced unfinished business had nothing to do with her lingering presence. More likely, it was her need to stick her nose in where it wasn't wanted that kept her tied to the land of the living. "Mabel, I have called you on to give testimony for Nora Brightstar." Chairwoman Inglewood gestured to Nora and continued, "You must tell the council what you know about Sir Jack." "Murray," Nora finished with a nod. "Curious." Mabel trailed around the room and peered at each councilwoman. "You know, back in my day, they afforded a witch the opportunity to know what they were giving testimony in defence of. Seems only just to me." "You are bound to answer, Mabel," Chairwoman Inglewood cautioned. "Even in death you remain a part of the guild. You may leave if our practices don't meet with your approval." "Tut, tut, Marion." Mabel winked at Gretchen, as though she'd found some camaraderie with a kindred spirit. "I've been a servant of the Academy since even before your grandmother was born. I shall respect the council's wishes. Though what a knight who died centuries ago has to do with a stripling witch is quite puzzling." Nora snorted, presumably at the word stripling, and Mabel paused in front of her to squint. "Ah, yes, the one renowned for hexes. Such as they are these days, watered down to bothersome ailments. I suppose Sir Jack's end may account for the connection. Grisly stuff. Has the champion risen from his grave on his noble steed?" At least she'd gotten straight to the point, and Gretchen let go of a breath she didn't know she was holding. She knew about what happened. Now it only remained to be seen if she knew the location of the cursed head. "What do you know of the knight's death?" Chairwoman Inglewood barked, clicking her fingers. "I'll have your full attention, Mabel." The ghost turned with a cackle and flashed her teeth in a mocking grin. "Well, it certainly halted any plans the Goldworthy clan had of instilling their name in the gentry. Zita always had a terrible temper. She claims the knight deflowered her niece, but she thrust that girl into his arms, hoping for a match." Beatrice squawked in outrage, but Mabel just spoke over the racket. As the chairwoman of the council, she took it upon herself to claim his judgment within her jurisdiction. Some flimsy claim about a potion being involved, which had more holes in it than a sieve. She executed him, along with his prized mount, in haste without a trial in the Academy's own courtyard. After that she carried off the head to damn his soul, as though her sentence should reign even beyond the veil. Grizzly didn't begin to describe it, and Gretchen reckoned her eyes were just about as wide as everyone else's in the room. From the council's surprise, Gretchen guessed the written account had been thoroughly sanitized for future generations. If what Nora said was true about wizards being instrumental in tearing down the Academy's power, Gretchen had to admit they had good cause. The revelation had quieted even Beatrice, whose face blanched to an even pastier shade. The head. Chairwoman Inglewood's eyes burned with intensity. "Do you know of its location?" Mabel held her belly and screeched with laughter. Faces with owl-like eyes looked at each other in surprise around the room, and it took Chairwoman Inglewood thumping her cane down on the slate floors to halt the cacophony. "Why, this is precious." Mabel swiped at her eyes, and another unhinged giggle escaped her lips. "You seek my advice through gritted teeth when the witch best suited to answer your questions sits among your ranks. Too shamed, perhaps, Beatrice, to tell them about that heirloom of yours?" All eyes snapped toward the councilwoman, who shifted in her seat uncomfortably. From pale, her cheeks bloomed a nasty red, and she shook her head frantically. "I have no idea what she's talking about." "It's on your mantelpiece," Mabel scoffed, "though why anyone would want to keep a shriveled head out in the open is beyond my reckoning." "No," Beatrice screeched as she stood, "I'll have none of this. Lies meant to inflict harm to the family name, a plot devised by a bright star whose cunning outstrips that of her aunt, and this malicious phantom who plagues these halls only corroborates because she has nothing better to do." "I've seen it." Councilwoman Hattie's voice was calm, but it carried over the tirade. The woman's wore a guarded expression, though a slight wrinkling of her nose gave away her disdain. "I've sat in your apartments enough times to take note of something as unusual as a shriveled head, though I thought perhaps it was a pig." Bingo, Gretchen thought, though she wasn't expecting to hear the thing was shriveled. Beatrice's mouth worked, and the mood of the room darkened. It would take someone pretty stupid to say the first word in that kind of situation, but Gretchen felt compelled to break the ice. "So, I guess that's the problem solved then?" Gretchen stood and stretched her arms overhead. "I suppose you gals have a lot to talk over, so maybe we'll just swing past and pick up the head, then go take care of this ghost, huh?" Nora rubbed the bridge of her nose, and Chairwoman Inglewood gave Gretchen a look she hadn't seen since she'd been caught pilfering from the supply cupboard at school. "You two will wait out in the hall. The council must confer, and will give you instructions when we see fit." "Great." Gretchen took a deep breath to keep from rolling her eyes, and spun on her heel for the door. Nora looked hesitant to leave and miss out on all the juicy details, but followed Gretchen out the door. They both shared a look, then jumped when Chairwoman Inglewood screeched, "That goes for you too, Mabel!" Thankfully, the ghost departed via the ceiling, and didn't pursue Gretchen and Nora to talk about what happened. Gretchen clicked the door shut, then narrowed her eyes at her pal. "I knew that wouldn't go down well. They'll have us waiting for hours now." It was well past midnight when Cordelia opened the doors again to usher them off to Beatrice's apartments. Nora's probing questions were met with matter-of-fact statements. They were ordered to take the head and see to the ghost. The council required a full written report. It was to be handled with the utmost secrecy, which Gretchen figured meant no essay for Elod, and Nora was to report directly to Chairwoman Inglewood once the mission was complete. After being left in another hallway so Cordelia could rifle through Beatrice's things in a more dignified manner, Nora smothered a yawn. She agreed they should head back to Edgewater under the moonlight at Gretchen's insistence, and it wasn't long before they trudged out the doors of the academy. There was one stop along the way, over to the Salt and Bog to pick up Piper. There, Gretchen agreed to rest for the night when she saw the girl sleeping in a guest bedroom, surrounded by all of Nora's junk. Crawling into the bed beside her, Gretchen only bothered with kicking off her boots before succumbing to slumber. Gretchen yawned and blinked as she sat at the kitchen table of the Salt and Bog, and groaned gratefully when Jürgen set a mug of coffee in front of her. She took a sip with eyes closed, savouring the morning elixir of wakefulness. "So how'd you two get on last night?" Jürgen looked as though he'd already been up for hours and whistled as he fried eggs over the hearth. "We went out to the forest." Piper grinned, and Gretchen was glad she'd quit sulking over being excluded from the council meeting. "And when we got back, I made this." The girl set a bottle on the table, and Gretchen frowned at the vivid white liquid inside. "A new light potion," Piper explained. "Uncle Jürgen knew exactly where to find the blue ones. Not as hard as you witches make it out to be." Jürgen threw over his shoulder with a chuckle. "Or perhaps I'm just a better woodsman." "This looks good." Gretchen held the potion up to the sunlight streaming through the window and gave an appreciative nod. "And all by yourself, too." "There was some junk in the pantry which helped, and I only needed to find 1 or 2 ingredients from Nora's things." "Well, I'm just sad Nora didn't have to eat her own boots while watching you brew this," Gretchen chortled. "I would have liked to have seen her face when—" "Who's eating whose boots now?" Nora's voice carried down from the top of the stairs. Then her footfalls sounded. "Because whatever is cooking down there smells good." Piper's eyes widened, but Gretchen only made a face in reply. When Nora appeared in the doorway, Gretchen held out the potion and wiggled it in a told-you-so gesture. The older witch stopped in her tracks, pushed her spectacles further up her nose, and cleared her throat. A light potion? I must admit it looks the part. She helped herself from the coffee pot and joined them at the table. I should probably stick to what I know best, HM. Even Jurgen seemed to agree with the sentiment, as he turned with a pan full of breakfast and snorted. They made quick work of filling their bellies, while Nora recounted what she could about the council meeting and their duty to see the horseman's head returned. "But you know nothing about it, you hear?" Nora pushed her plate aside and levelled a stare at Piper and Jurgen. "Top secret stuff. If you didn't already know about the ghost, I would have told you nothing." "That's not fair," Piper pleaded, and looked to Gretchen for confirmation. "Elod had a bauble, and he said—" "We'll share nothing with wizards, and I'll hear nothing more about it," Nora clucked. "This is a cover-up operation. Gretchen here will go back to Elod's and tell him she found her hat, ate the wrong kind of mushrooms or something, and left it up a tree." Gretchen curled her lip, but wasn't in a position to argue. Elod would see right through a story like that, but she didn't want to mess up her friend's shot at working as a secret agent. Maybe not a written report, but maybe she could swing by with Piper and have a quiet word with the old guy. She doubted he would blab, and if he did, bad mushrooms would do nicely to muddy the credibility of her claim after the fact. Nora didn't put up much of a fuss after that, and Jurgen came along to witness the spectacle of the curse's undoing. Doubt niggled in Gretchen's belly, the fear of Jack being loose from the binding growing with each step into the forest. Even with his head returned, Gretchen wondered if the ghost was liable to lop off any others on his way out. She watched Piper as she climbed over bracken and decided if anything went afoul, Jurgen could get the girl to safety. But when they entered the clearing leading to the old mine, the quartz circle remained, and inside Sir Jack was much as they left him, mounted and rigid like a toy soldier. "I feel it." Sir Jack's deep timbre sounded almost mournful. "After all this time, it's strange." He reached a gauntleted hand to where his head should be, and Gretchen planted her fists on her hips. "That's our end of the bargain. Now hand over my darn hat." Sir Jack barked a nasty laugh. "You think I haven't tangled with your kind before? I remain behind this circle. My only bargaining chip is this withered scrap of leather. You'd see me bound for all eternity." "Sheesh." Gretchen puffed out her cheeks. "That's a little melodramatic. What would I use a ghost for anyhow? All eternity with a grumpy dead knight doesn't sound like a good deal to me." "Then let me out." Sir Jack turned his mount in a tight circle. "And I shall relinquish it willingly." "That's quite enough." Nora huffed and stepped closer. "We at least have come to the bargaining table unarmed. What's to stop you swinging that axe of yours? Toss your weapons over, and I'll dispel the circle." "Unarmed?" Sir Jack snorted. "Madam, a witch is never defenceless." "Be that as it may," Nora clucked. "We've inflicted no pain upon your spectre. We've returned with your head at great expense. Even after assaulting Gretchen, we haven't sought to see you suffer. If you don't trust our word, hand the weapons over to Jurgen." Sir Jack recoiled, and if he had a face, Gretchen figured his expression would be akin to having a nugget of something unpleasant under his nose. Jurgen said nothing but shot Nora a long-suffering look. "The troll? In our day we hunted the foul creatures. You think I'd hand my weapons willingly to that monster? I don't care if it's wearing pants." Jurgen spoke up then, and Gretchen smirked at the knight's surprise. "These pants belong to the last man who refused to stow his weapons in my bar." The troll hawked and spat on the ground. "But I always turn a patron's effects over when they leave. There's a child present. We wish for no bloodshed." Piper, who had lingered by Jurgen's side, tiptoed to Gretchen, as the troll stepped toward the circle with a hand outstretched. Nora pulled out the shriveled head from under her cloak and held it up in entreaty. Gretchen glared at her hat swinging from Sir Jack's saddle, and all was silent in the standoff. Tense seconds passed, then a grumble reverberated in the knight's cuirass. "Fine," he spat, as he tossed his weapon over the quartz line. A blink of light flashed as the barrier was breached, but the axe passed through, and Jurgen snatched the transparent weapon out of the air. "Let us be done with this." Gretchen offered her hand to Nora, but she only gave a small shake of her head. Raising her arms, she closed her eyes and chanted the spell to bring down the barrier. Wind whipped up around the clearing, and Piper pressed her face into Gretchen's cloak. Even with her eyes closed, the brilliance of the quartz exploding into dust blared behind her lids. Blinking, Gretchen drew Piper back lest the knight decide to trample them all. But his quarry was with Nora, and she stood her ground as Sir Jack approached. "The hat!" she ordered, with a nod at the saddle. With a disinterested grunt, Sir Jack snapped the leather lace, binding the hat to his saddle, and flung it in Gretchen's general direction. Before she could snatch it off the ground, Sir Jack lunged just as Nora lobbed the head toward him, and as it struck his cuirass, a ghostly head flared above his shoulders. It was gone almost the moment it appeared, with the knight's form twisting into a maelstrom of vapour and dissipating into the air with a hiss. Gretchen stared until Nora dusted off her hands and was reminded of her returned property. "My hat!" Her face broke into a wide grin as Piper stooped to collect it. She clamped the familiar leather down over her brow and sighed. Thank the light. Jurgen stepped over to the group and balanced a perfectly solid axe in his hands. Was this supposed to happen? Goodness, no, Nora squawked. Though I doubt Sir Jack would have much need of it now. It should fetch a good price as an antique, though nobody is likely to believe that it isn't a replica. Jurgen traced the fine tooling on the blade and shrugged. Looks like I don't always hand back weapons. So that's it then? Piper asked. It's done. Well, if by done you mean it's time to get to school and turn in your new assignment, sure. Gretchen chuckled. Nora can take you. Me and my hat have got some catching up to do, with a cup of tea and maybe some leather oil. Thank you for joining me on this festive journey through The Head of the Horseman, Episode 10 of the Gretchen's Misadventures series. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more enchanting readings and fantastical tales. Share your thoughts on this epic misadventure, or recommend your favourite fantasy reads in the comments below. Your insights are the magic that keeps this community thriving. If you're ready for more of Gretchen and her mystical escapades, give this video a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all things magical right here. Until our next adventure, may your books be filled with wonder and your days with magic. Happy reading!